Now the last item on the agenda will be a technical presentation on the Critical Raw Materials Act. I hope this time I am right by saying that we have here with us Mr. Peter Handley. Yes, Head of Energy Intensive Industries Raw Materials Hydrogen Unit in DG GROW. It was also discussed today, the main directions with Commissioner Thierry Breton, and clearly the critical raw materials was an issue that we advocated many times in the past weeks and months. We had also an initiative report, and I have here our former rapporteur, Mrs. Bentele. But now I know that European Commission came with a very good initiative, also taking into account the application and permitting granting process for strategic raw materials projects, the detailed provisions on supply risk monitoring and mitigation, actions aimed at sustainability, as well as strategic partnerships. As Commissioner Breton explained, our ambition, which is ambitious, is to go to 10% from 3%. So clearly, we need also the partnerships in order to have the necessary amount of critical raw materials for everything that we need. That's why I go directly to Mr. Handley to hear his presentation, and then I think we'll do just one round, as I don't see all the colleagues on the list being present in the room, but we'll see. Maybe some of them will join from their offices during the next minutes. Please, Mr. Handley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just got 3 slides here. Let's see. How does it work? Yes. This looks like a different set of slides from the one I was planning to present, but it's the slides I presented to the Council Working Party last week. This is largely consistent with what you've already heard from Commissioner Breton, the drivers for change. I think I would just emphasize that in our concept, it's 3 equally important drivers for change: the green transition, the digital transition, and the need to build defense and aerospace capabilities, particularly in view of today's very troubled geopolitics. The second point to mention really is about the dependency that Europe has for the critical raw materials, which is very much a value chain phenomenon. It's not just where the ores are found in the ground, it's the fact that wherever they are found, they tend to find their way to one place for processing and refining and making into products, and that's China. And that over-concentration of supply is what we consider to be one of the main issues that needs to be addressed here. Let me get the slides up. Or maybe I do it without slides.
Do you have problem with presentation? Do you have some technical problems with the presentation? Because we cannot see it on the screens. Everything fine, Mr. Nica? Okay. I think now it's the right one. Okay.
All right. Let's. It's doing all sorts of stupidities here.
If you want, just say next and...
Right, yeah. We'll start with that one. So I've already mentioned the drivers. I've mentioned the growing dependency as you go along the value chain, as you can see from the pie charts around rare earths and permanent magnets. The third message on this slide is about future demand. And what we've tried to do, it's a very important message. We've tried to look at how we can dampen demand and yet still achieve our policy objectives. We've heard in the previous session about the role of energy efficiency in terms of needing less materials to achieve certain goals. We actually explicitly asked the Joint Research Centre in its foresight study to look at different scenarios to see how we could dampen that demand. And one of the areas where we found that was the easiest to do was in the mobility sector, because you can think about different ways of having a sharing economy, and not every family needing a large SUV, plug-in SUV. So there are ways to make better use of available raw materials. And also, what we did find out is that the mere massive amount of ramping up of the deployment of renewable and clean energy technologies is going to be much more metals and minerals intensive than the fossil fuel system which it replaces. So there are trade-offs to be made, but we're looking forward to having discussions about how we can find the best landing point for those forecasts for the future. Now let's see if this works. I'm not going to go into detail. This is very much as the Commissioner has explained it already this afternoon. I'll get a little bit into the pillars. The benchmarks have been discussed. I think the difference between critical and strategic was something that my cabinet asked me to go into a little bit more. We have a long-established methodology for looking at the criticality of raw materials used throughout the EU economy. So, as I say, it's about the whole EU economy, and it's looking really at two parameters: the supply chain risk at different points. It can be at the mining stage, at the processing stage, but also at the economic importance. And it's the combination of these factors combined with elements such as environmental, social and governance standards, or recycling or substitution capability, which give us what we find on our list of critical raw materials. But we were asked also to take a different approach, a more focused approach, to zoom in on a subset of materials, which are those that are used for the strategic technologies that correspond to the three drivers: the green, the digital, defense and aerospace. And using a combination of factors, that's what we have done to come up with a set of 16 strategic raw materials, which are now with the co-legislators for your scrutiny. The Commission has talked about the process of strategic projects and the benefits of these being in terms of faster permitting and easier access to finance. What I would like to stress is, if you look at the legal proposal, you have got all the assurances that we are not going to do this at the expense of the environmental society. We're not going to dispense with environmental impact assessments and things like that. We're not going to throw out the rule book on water or air pollution. What we are doing is looking at whether we have a fit-for-purpose permitting system to get these strategic objectives achieved. And we can see that there are lots of ways to do this. We've seen it with renewable energy in the proposal last year. We've seen it in the net zero proposal as well. So we're using familiar building blocks for achieving faster results. And moving on to the next slide. I hope. The risk mitigation, this is where we really want to plug into the best expertise available around Europe in terms of identifying the risks facing supply chain security, looking at stress testing, giving advice to governments and companies, asking companies over 500 employees that are involved in producing green, digital or defense aerospace products to take a close look at their vulnerabilities and to look at the measures they may need to take to improve resilience. And why not? Investing in projects that have a good low footprint, investing in projects which will give them a range of supply options as opposed to relying on a single one. And this is only an accountability towards their own shareholders. It's not towards the Commission, it's not towards the national government. But we do encourage member states to introduce whatever incentives will help companies to take the right measures. I'm sorry for the clunkiness here. We've discussed at length, the Commission has discussed at length all the different sustainability and circularity elements. And the Critical Raw Materials Board is the way that we propose to capture all the necessary expertise in the member states also in the European Parliament, and plug into the expertise available throughout industry, throughout industrial alliances, and also from the financial institutions and geological surveys. What I would say, not from regulation, but from the communication which accompanies it, is that we have flanking measures. One of those flanking measures is on skills. We've talked about creating a raw materials academy, but we've also talked not only about creating skills in businesses, but also in public administrations. It's all very well saying we'll shorten the deadlines for permitting, but we have to make sure that permitting authorities have enough people in the right place with the right competencies to do the work. So that's an area where we're ready to provide assistance through the SG Reform Technical Support Instrument. Research and innovation is another very big part of the message we have in the communication. We see a big place for substitution, for advanced materials. We see a lot of scope for cleaner ways of mining, processing, recycling of raw materials. So we think that the whole research and innovation agenda can provide us with a lot of the solutions that we need. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We go now to the interventions. We'll do one round. We have 7 colleagues here. Of course, we start with the coordinators or representatives of the political groups. And I start with EPP. Mrs. Bentele, please.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. My opinion is that we have a very good proposal here and that we hope that it's going to, we're going to continue being informed as we go along. But I must say that what really concerns me is the paper that we've gotten, that we need to make sure that we actually implement this program. So we've got to make sure that those who are going to be using critical raw materials are actually on board as well. So what do you expect? That's what's missing, this kind of urgency for those who are going to be using these critical raw materials, the people who are going to be actually demanding that. So I think we should look at our delivery chain. We should make sure that we want to try and diversify by 85%, but I think that we need to focus more on the industry itself. We make sure that they're involved in the strategic project. Make sure that they come under the strategic project, so that they are part of the developing the project. So quite specifically, what are you expecting from the private sector? As far as this legislation goes, we know, obviously, that there is a question about financing. That's obviously very, very important for the private sector, and there are obviously expectations there. But how can we tell them more than simply talking about the sovereign fund at the end of the summer? We're not sure whether it's going to go through or not, and we don't know whether there is any fresh money available. So the question for you now from me is there money available, or what do we need to do to ensure that investment is actually drawn, or that there is some kind of incentive? I'm not going to try and open up the taxonomy for the miners. We all know about that. But I think we've got to take it very seriously and see how the private industry can be involved in the implementation of this, and perhaps be a little bit more concrete on the financial side. Thank you.
Mr. Nica, please.
Sunt eu?
Yes, Mr. Nica.
Mulțumesc.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. When I heard in the same sentence strategic and critical, it gave me the shivers. I thought something's gonna happen. So I was very careful when you gave your presentation. It's a very good presentation, but something is missing. First of all, where would we be getting our raw materials? Or what percentage of the raw materials used should be used from the EU? Because we have 16 of the 31st critical and strategic raw materials in Romania. But guess what? The European Commission has forced us to close down the mines, and now we can't get a permit to reopen them. Do you think that this problem could be solved for such materials that are not important, such as lithium, wolfram, magnesium, graphite, just such materials that could really help us? And then we can also talk about Sweden, which has one of the largest reserves that have been discovered lately. And then a second question. This is how we talk about everything, I would have expected you to say, where can we find critical raw materials so that we can diversify our supply, and where would we be processing these? And then we can give state aid for those that process in the EU critical raw materials that have been extracted from European soil or have been imported so that we could also produce lithium for batteries in the EU? Because you said that we can't really count on those on whom we are dependent, 80% dependent right now. So I'd like to ask you to tell us clearly how we can do these things so that these names, strategic, critical, are not simple words, but are something that is palpable, something that we can see, and then if something wrong happens, we and the EU can say that we are protected and that the things that we need are here for us. Thank you very much.
Nica.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nica.
The Greens is Mrs. Han.
Yes, thank you very much, dear Mr. Handley, for your in-depth presentation, and I really appreciate your devotion and expertise you have on critical raw materials. And I mentioned it today already in ITRE with Commissar Breton that I think that the recycling target of 15% is not ambitious enough, working towards a fully circular economy in the long-term perspective. So you might have a comment on that as well. I would be grateful for that. And as a second point, I mean, so many aspects were mentioned already, but beyond the general provisions on circularity, the proposal also contains specific provisions targeting permanent magnets. And indeed, permanent magnets certainly play a crucial role in the energy transition for several green technologies. So the provisions to facilitate the recycling and use of recycled content of raw materials in permanent magnets are welcome, of course, but I wondered why the Commission has decided to limit this approach in its proposal to permanent magnets only. So I would be grateful for some comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madame Marie Doshi, au nom du groupe ID. S'il vous plaît.
Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Chair, dear colleagues, demand for critical raw materials is going to be increasing quite considerably in the coming years, and we depend on imports from third countries. Sometimes they have a quasi-monopoly in China, for example. And yet, since the COVID-19 and the Ukraine war, we seem to have had an electroshock in Europe, because we've seen that the worst side of the free trade experts here in Europe. And I think that we've got to try and ensure that we don't actually try and export ultra-liberalism from the EU at a time when the protectionism is coming back to bite us. I think that this dogma is going to fail in a strategic area such as this. So I think that we should actually welcome the awareness of the Commission in presenting this text, because this text is actually presenting a set of good sense measures to try and end this dependence by guaranteeing the EU access to a secure and sustainable source of these critical raw materials. And in particular, I think it's important that we have reference values on the capacity for the EU in self-production to process these materials on our own soil, to make sure that we can limit the provenance of these materials from third countries. I think it's important that we actually also continue to prospect the existence of such materials in the European Union. We've got to simplify our administrative procedures, indeed, and the procedures that are required before extraction activities can be undertaken. It's also important that we focus on circularity and also the sustainability side of this. However, the respect of the environment and social standards are not really mentioned in detail in this proposal. And especially for the critical raw materials, very often they are extracted by people, it's often children, who are paid a pittance and working in very poor labour conditions. Liberalism has actually been imposed on countries of the Union, which has led to this situation today, where merchandise is being produced by virtual slaves and being sold to the unemployed. This text does not enable us to limit our dependence on third countries or to create jobs in Europe while protecting the environment and and also labour working standards. Thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yesterday, I think we had the pleasure to follow a presentation here on a study conducted by researchers from Bruegel and TNO. One of them was a former colleague of mine. It was a pleasure to see him here because I think the study was very good. But if I remember correctly, one of the main conclusions they had is that when it comes to critical raw materials, it is important for the EU to look at the full, complete value chain. And this is a bit what I'm missing when I look at the act today presented by the Commission. There's a focus on critical raw materials, but how we'll make sure that we are less dependent on third countries for this supply. I mean, there are some elements on diversification, but I think we need to narrow it down a bit more. Then one very crucial element. We need to make sure that demand does not become bigger and bigger. How are we going to manage this? And then one critical element, how are we going to get the critical raw materials towards the sectors that need them to first make the products for the Net Zero Industry Act and get these products to the sectors to decarbonize? Will we come up with a merit order, or is that something we cannot mention here? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Madame Valérie Hayer, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also to the Commission. I've got two questions. One is on the timetable, because we know that if we want to ensure that we have sovereignty in provision of critical raw materials, it's going to take some time. And as you said earlier on, we have very clear objectives as far as development of new technologies is concerned. So I'd like to know how we're going to make sure that the measures that have been proposed are going to enable us to do this. How are we going to be sure that we have the resources in good time to meet our objectives in industrial policy terms in the framework of the Net Zero Industrial Act? Another element that I wanted to raise, because obviously our hope for strategic raw materials is trying to ensure that we are able to meet our responsibilities at world level, all the contracts that we are, the agreements that we've signed up to. So how do we make sure that we're not actually doing one thing, which is going to be at the degradation of the environment, for example, or how are we going to make sure that we're going to meet our commitments in climate terms and ecological terms today and for future agreements? Thank you.
And full support to the European Commission proposal on critical raw materials. It's clear that we need to become more self-reliant and more independent when it comes to the raw materials. I think we critically need to discuss whether the ambition level is the right one, whether we could actually increase some of the percentages that you mentioned. For example, the recycling percentage of 15%. Could that not be higher? It doesn't seem so ambitious to me. What is your background for proposing the 15%? Then I would also like to ask you about, our over-dependence on Chinese raw materials that have been processed in China. I think it's 90% of the critical materials that come through China in one way or the other. Could we consider, according to you, in this proposal, to set a max percentage of the import from one country when it comes to critical raw materials? 90% is surely too much, and it should be lower than that, but could there be a maximum percentage of import from one country in this proposal? I think that's something we should consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one request for Catch the Eye. Short intervention from Mr. Pekarinen.
Arvoisa puheenjohtaja.
Chair. In Finland, we don't have nuclear. And we've got to pay large amounts to various funds that have been created to manage the transition when we moved away from nuclear power. We debated this for a very long time. So this has been debated for a long time about whether in Finland we wanted to go down this path and whether in Finland we should start to store certain critical raw materials. In Finland, for example, we are the 7th or 8th producer of critical materials, and we've known this for some time. And we have had important debates on this. When we look at the size of our reserves in certain raw materials, I think it's interesting to see that there are zones where we used to be able to produce critical raw materials, and where these. What we'd like to know is where these materials are going to be stored, because we have there are certain countries that do have reserves. Where are these going to be stored? How are they going to be extracted, and where will they be stored?
Claude, you want to intervene? Okay. 1 minute.
Okay. W swoim wystąpieniu chcę się skupić na technicznych aspektach.
I will focus on technical aspects of critical raw materials. It doesn't make sense to make considerations about economic independence if we do not increase the production of critical raw materials here in the EU. Such an approach can be irritating to some of those present in these rooms, but that's the naked truth. We have huge deposits of materials, and in the current times of rapid change, we cannot afford not to extract them and not to use them. We must simplify and speed up the procedures for approving extraction them in the European Union. Secondly, we must provide stability for investors and producers. Opening a mine is expensive. The companies who get a permit must be certain that this would be rentable, that this would be paid back. But so far, we are doing things to the contrary. We're spending billions on renewable, and this is difficult to understand, that extracting critical raw materials is not being financed properly. My question is this: are you planning on new sources of financing for developing strategic projects in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Handley, please.
Thank you very much for the questions. The private sector will have a very important role to play in the delivery of this Critical Raw Materials Act. And we don't start from nowhere. I mean, in 2020, we created the European Raw Materials Alliance. It's got more than 600 companies involved. This is an excellent way for them to find each other in terms of investment partners all along the value chain, not only in Europe, but also with trusted third countries. And thanks to the efforts of the EIT on raw materials, we have already put together an investment pipeline. So we know where to start from. And there will also be other industrial alliances, such as the Solar Alliance, the Batteries Alliance, and others, which will be able to feed us work from their investment pipelines, that we can make a good fast start on this. And we will also need to work closely with private businesses, because they're the ones who need to make the investments in projects in Europe and projects outside Europe. We see it already. The automotive sectors realize that they have to look upstream and get more vertical integration if they want to be sure of being in business 10 years down the road. We see companies investing in mines, we see companies investing in processing and setting the framework conditions and securing the prices for the materials they'll need for the years to come. And I think this is a positive development. There's loads of questions about will there be new money? And we've been very clear, there is no new dedicated investment fund for critical raw materials in an article of this regulation. What we are saying is that we will accompany all of these strategic projects by looking at the financing needs of each one. We'll be working with the board, we'll be working with industry, we'll be working with the banks and financial institutions to see how we can bring in the manufacturing sector as off-takers or equity investors in projects. We'll be looking at how we can get the European banks like the EIB and the EBRD to really accompany us and help to de-risk for the other banks. We'll be looking with the member states at what's the best mix of their national funding, state aids, export credits, development assistance, and we'll be looking to see which is the best blend of available European funds to secure these projects. I think the key message is blending, convergence to deliver the strategic projects. And as the Commissioner has said, let's wait and see what the Sovereignty Fund brings in a few months' time. There were questions about the level of ambition of the benchmarks, and this is obviously one of the issues where the co-legislators will want to chew over the numbers and see if they make sense. I would simply say that these are numbers which are aggregate numbers, and what we really want to see is that whatever the starting point of an individual strategic raw material, and we're happy to provide you with the elements of fact where we start from today, I think that's very important as part of the discussion. We want to see positive movement by every strategic raw material, at the extraction stage, at the recycling stage, and at the refining stage, and at the recycling stage. Where people say that a 15% recycling target is not ambitious, depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at base metals like copper, then you've got very high recycling rates already. But look at many of the rather niche critical raw materials, and today's recycling rate is a pitiful less than 1%. So 15% is a massive and very ambitious step up for those. But happy to have that discussion and look at the data together with you. And Ms. Hahn was asking why we're only proposing measures on permanent magnets. And I would say actually we're not, because if you look at the first section of the circularity section of the proposal, it's a list of things where we're asking member state governments to take very sort of strong action across a wide range of recovery and recycling to get the secondary raw materials. The reason we've singled out permanent magnets is because it's, if you like, it's the poster child for our excess strategic dependency, and it's necessary for our green, for our digital, and for our defence. So it's crucial to do something here. And in fact, we're not just proposing to address the recycling through that provision you see later in the regulation. If you look back to the beginning where we set the benchmarks for extraction, refining and recycling, that also applies to the rare earth and permanent magnet value chain. So we want to look at it from a value chain approach. Ms. Dalshy was referring to the fact that to reduce dependencies we should also explore more, and we do in fact have a provision where we're asking member states to look at the resources we have domestically in our subsoil, and we're also looking at them to look at the potential we have in the mining, tailings and waste, which is already on the surface, so that we can use both of these sources of domestic material to reduce our strategic dependency. There were also questions about sourcing from third countries, the human rights side, and also the refining side. It's very important to realise that when we're proposing to engage with third countries, we're going to take a very close look at the human conditions, at the social conditions, and the public governance that go along with engaging with these countries. They're not always the easiest countries to engage with, but we think that if we provide the framework through these strategic partnerships to show that we're long-term partners, and if we take seriously that we want to help them move along the value chain into refining, notably processing and refining, it will help them to keep value in the country, help them to develop skills. It will also help us, because the more we can get many parts of the world to refine raw materials, the less it's all going to go to China. I don't think, Mr. Chain, we're going to be talking about priority allocations of, but you've raised this before. Let's have the discussion in the committee. Let's have a look what else. There was a question from Mr. Fugelsang about whether we should be more stringent on the maximum level of imports from one country. We do actually have a figure which is actually more ambitious than 90%, because 65% is more ambitious than 90%. We're actually saying we should source from several countries, and from no single country should we import more than 65% of our consumption needs. This is extremely ambitious, and will only be met by a combination of ramping up our domestic production throughout the value chain and diversifying externally. I think the final remark I would like to make is that we're living a little bit of a hypocrisy at the moment, because the European Union consumes a vast amount of metals and minerals, and it's not doing its fair share in terms of sourcing its own needs or doing more. So we have to show more responsibility, and as the Commissioner said, when we talk to countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or even closer to home, they may well turn around and say, you're just outsourcing your raw material needs to us. Show us you're prepared to make an effort yourself. And I think through the critical raw materials proposal, that's precisely what we're trying to do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, dear colleagues, for participating to the debate. Of course, we'll continue our work and dialogue with the European Commission. We will not have a meeting on 13th of April, but the next meeting will be on 24th and 25th of April. Thank you, ITRE Secretariat, services of the Parliament, and big thanks to the interpreters.
Thank you.
Thank you.